Moscow, Soviet Union, February 14, 1983, 2:47 a.m. Senior Lieutenant Alexei Volkov of the GRU's 3rd Directorate stood in the dimly lit corridor of the Leningradsky railway station, watching a woman in a gray wool coat purchase a ticket to Leningrad with cash. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this journey before. Her Russian was flawless, her documents impeccable, her posture that of a tired secretary returning home after visiting family in the capital. Everything about her said ordinary. Everything except the fact that Volkov had been ordered to follow her for the past 6 weeks, and in that time, he had found absolutely nothing. No dead drops, no brush passes, no suspicious meetings, no coded messages in classified ads, no visits to known CIA safe houses, no contact with Western diplomats, no use of surveillance detection routes, nothing that would justify the resources the 2nd Chief Directorate had allocated to her case. Just a woman who worked as a translator at the Ministry of Culture, lived alone in a communal apartment, bought groceries, attended ballet performances, and took the overnight train to Leningrad twice a month to visit her elderly mother. The problem was that her mother had been dead for 3 years. To understand how a decorated Soviet intelligence officer came to commit what the KGB would later classify as the most damaging act of treason in GRU history, you have to understand the machinery of Cold War counterintelligence and the particular paranoia that gripped Moscow in the early 1980s. The Soviet Union was hemorrhaging secrets. The CIA had penetrated the GRU. The NSA was reading Soviet communications. Western intelligence services seemed to know about military deployments before some Soviet generals did. The KGB's 2nd Chief Directorate, responsible for internal counterintelligence, was under immense pressure to find the leaks. Every anomaly became a potential spy. Every inconsistency in a background check became grounds for surveillance. Every unexplained absence became evidence of clandestine activity. The system operated on the principle that guilt could be constructed from the accumulation of small deviations from the norm. A woman visiting a dead mother was such a deviation. Her name was Elena Sokolova, or at least that was the name on her internal passport. She was 32 years old, unmarried, a graduate of Moscow State University's Institute of Asian and African Studies with specialization in English and French. Her personnel file showed exemplary performance reviews, no foreign contacts, no ideological deviations, no family members who had emigrated or been arrested. She had been vetted, cleared, and deemed suitable for work that occasionally brought her into contact with foreign delegations. But someone in the 2nd Chief Directorate had noticed the discrepancy about her mother. And once noticed, it could not be unnoticed. The surveillance order was issued. Volkov was assigned. He was 29 years old, a career intelligence officer who had joined the GRU at 22 after graduating from the Military Diplomatic Academy. His specialty was counterintelligence analysis, the systematic study of how foreign intelligence services recruited and ran agents in Soviet territory. He had studied CIA tradecraft, MI6 protocols, Mossad techniques. He knew the patterns. He knew what to look for. And in 6 weeks of watching Elena Sokolova, he had seen none of them. What he had seen instead was a woman who read Pushkin on the metro, who bought flowers for herself on Fridays, who attended performances at the Bolshoi alone and sat in the cheap seats, who walked through Gorky Park in the snow, hands in her pockets, looking at nothing in particular, who seemed, in every observable way, to be exactly what she claimed to be, a woman living a quiet, unremarkable life in a city that did not encourage remarkable lives. The surveillance protocol required him to maintain distance, to observe without engaging, to document without interpreting. But 6 weeks of following someone creates a strange intimacy. You learn their rhythms. You anticipate their movements. You begin to see the world through their patterns. Volkov found himself wondering what she thought about during those long walks, what she was reading when she sat in cafes with a book and a glass of tea, why she always chose the window seat on the train to Leningrad. The operational question was simple. Where did she go when she told her colleagues she was visiting her mother? The surveillance teams had followed her to Leningrad station, watched her board the Red Arrow Express, confirmed her arrival in Leningrad. But then she disappeared. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested professional counter-surveillance. She simply went somewhere the surveillance teams could not follow without revealing themselves. The KGB's Leningrad office had been notified. They had assets at the station, watchers who could pick up the trail. But Leningrad was a large city, and if she knew she might be followed, she could lose them in the crowds. The decision was made to let her run, to see where she went, to wait for her to make contact with whoever she was meeting. Volkov had read the reports. Each trip to Leningrad followed the same pattern. She would arrive at Moscow station, take a taxi to the city center, check into a small hotel near the Hermitage, and then vanish for approximately 18 hours. She would reappear the next afternoon, take the evening train back to Moscow, and return to work the following day as if nothing had happened. 18 hours. Enough time for a meeting. Enough time for a debriefing. Enough time to pass documents, receive instructions, collect payment. Enough time for espionage. But also enough time for a dozen other things. An affair, a second job, a secret hobby, a medical condition she didn't want her colleagues to know about. The problem with counterintelligence is that secrecy is not proof of espionage. People keep secrets for many reasons. The challenge is determining which secrets matter. On this particular night, February 14, 1983, Volkov made a decision that violated every protocol he had been trained to follow. Instead of maintaining surveillance distance, instead of coordinating with the Leningrad team, instead of waiting for her to make a mistake, he bought a ticket on the same train. The Red Arrow departed at 2:55 a.m. Volkov boarded 3 cars behind Elena, found an empty compartment, and settled in for the 8-hour journey. He told himself this was tactical. He could observe her interactions with other passengers. He could see if anyone made contact. He could watch for signs of counter-surveillance awareness. He could gather intelligence that static surveillance might miss. But the truth, which he would later admit during his interrogation, was simpler and more dangerous. He wanted to understand her. Not as a surveillance target, not as a potential enemy agent, but as a person. 6 weeks of watching had created questions that observation alone could not answer. Who was she? What was she hiding? And why did someone who seemed so careful about covering her tracks choose such an obvious lie about visiting a dead mother? The train moved through the darkness of the Soviet winter, past industrial towns and frozen fields, carrying 2 people who did not yet know they were on a collision course with history. In one compartment, a woman who was not what she seemed. In another, a man who was about to discover that the greatest vulnerability in any intelligence system is not technology or tradecraft, but the human need to know. What happened next would expose fault lines in Soviet counterintelligence that the CIA had been probing for years. It would reveal how deeply American intelligence had penetrated the GRU. It would demonstrate the catastrophic consequences of what intelligence professionals call the honey trap, though this case would prove far more complex than that term suggests. And it would raise questions that remain classified in both Russian and American archives to this day. But on that train, in that moment, Volkov knew none of this. He knew only that somewhere in the darkness ahead, in a city built by Peter the Great to be Russia's window to the West, a woman with a dead mother was going to meet someone, and he was going to find out who. The operational mechanics of Cold War surveillance were built on layers of observation, each designed to compensate for the limitations of the others. Static surveillance, watchers positioned at key locations, could observe without moving but could not follow. Mobile surveillance, teams that followed on foot or in vehicles, could pursue but risked detection. Technical surveillance, bugs, phone taps, hidden cameras, could record without human presence but required installation and maintenance. The ideal operation combined all three, creating a web that the target could not escape. But every system has gaps. And in 1983, the gap in Soviet counterintelligence was Leningrad. The city was too large, too complex, too full of foreigners and tourists and sailors and artists for the KGB to monitor comprehensively. The Hermitage alone attracted thousands of visitors daily. The canals and bridges created natural choke points that made following someone without being seen nearly impossible. The communal apartments and shared courtyards meant that surveillance teams stood out, and the city's history of dissent and intellectual resistance meant that the local KGB office was overwhelmed with cases deemed higher priority than one translator who might be visiting a lover. Elena Sokolova understood this. She had been trained to understand it. Her CIA handlers had spent months studying Leningrad's surveillance environment before approving it as a meeting site. They had mapped the dead zones where KGB coverage was thin. They had identified hotels with exits that were not monitored. They had established protocols for detection and evasion that exploited the city's geography. But they had not anticipated that someone would follow her on the train itself. That was a deviation from standard Soviet surveillance practice, which relied on coordinated handoffs between regional offices. The Moscow team would observe her departure. The Leningrad team would observe her arrival. No one would waste resources on the 8 hours in between. Volkov's decision to board the Red Arrow was, from a tradecraft perspective, amateurish. It increased his exposure. It limited his options. It made him visible in a confined space where visibility was dangerous. But it also gave him something that static surveillance could never provide: proximity. At 6:15 a.m., as the train passed through Tver Oblast and the winter sun began to gray the horizon, Volkov walked to the dining car. He ordered tea and sat by the window, watching the landscape scroll past. 10 minutes later, Elena Sokolova entered the car, ordered coffee, and sat 3 tables away. She did not look at him. She did not acknowledge his presence. She opened a book, Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, a choice that Volkov noted with interest given the novel's themes of surveillance and paranoia, and began to read. She appeared completely absorbed, completely at ease, completely unaware that she was being watched. But Volkov had been trained to read micro-expressions, to notice the small tells that indicate awareness, and he saw them. The way her eyes moved to the door each time someone entered, the way she positioned herself with a view of the entire car, the way she held the book at an angle that allowed her to see reflections in the window. She knew, not that he specifically was following her, but that someone might be. This was the moment when Volkov should have retreated to his compartment, filed a report noting her surveillance awareness, and recommended escalation to a full counterintelligence investigation. This was the moment when training and protocol should have overridden curiosity. Instead, he stood, walked to her table, and said, That's a dangerous book to read on a train." She looked up. Her expression showed surprise, but not alarm. "Why dangerous?" "Because," Volkov said, "it makes you think about whether the people watching you are real or imagined." For 3 seconds, she studied his face. Then she smiled. "And which do you think they are?" "I think," Volkov said, "that depends on whether you're visiting your mother in Leningrad." The smile disappeared. Her hand moved slightly, a reflexive gesture toward her bag. Then she caught herself, forced her body to relax, and said, "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" "No," Volkov said, "but I know you. I know you work at the Ministry of Culture. I know you take this train twice a month. I know your mother died in 1980, and I know that in approximately 2 hours you're going to get off this train and disappear for 18 hours, and I would very much like to know where you go." This was the moment. The moment when a trained intelligence officer reveals herself or maintains her cover. The moment when fight-or-flight calculations happen faster than conscious thought. The moment when years of preparation meet unexpected reality. Elena Sokolova did neither. Instead, she said, "Sit down." Volkov sat. "Your GRU," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "How long have you been following me?" 6 weeks. "And you decided to approach me on a train because..." "Because," Volkov said. And here he made the second catastrophic decision of the morning. "I don't think you're a spy." She laughed. It was a genuine laugh, surprised and bitter. "Then you're not very good at your job." "Maybe," Volkov said. "Or maybe I'm better at it than my superiors think. A real spy wouldn't use such an obvious lie. A real spy wouldn't follow such a predictable pattern. A real spy wouldn't be so careful about everything, except the one thing that got her flagged in the first place." "So what do you think I am?" "I think," Volkov said, "you're someone who needs to go to Leningrad twice a month for a reason you can't tell your colleagues. And I think that reason might not be espionage. And I think if I'm right, you're going to be arrested and interrogated and possibly executed for something that isn't actually a crime against the state." She was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the landscape had changed to the flat, snow-covered approaches to Leningrad. The train was slowing. "And if you're wrong?" she asked. "Then I've just committed treason by warning you." "Why would you do that?" This was the question Volkov would be asked 17 times during his interrogation. Why would a decorated GRU officer trained in counterintelligence, vetted and trusted, compromise an active surveillance operation by revealing himself to the target? The official answer, the one that would appear in his file, was that he had been seduced, that this was a classic honey trap, that the CIA had identified him as vulnerable and deployed an agent to exploit his isolation and loneliness. But the truth, which Volkov maintained until his execution, was simpler. "Because I've been watching you for 6 weeks, and I've seen how you live. And I don't think someone who lives like that is betraying their country. I think they're trying to survive it." Elena Sokolova closed her book. She looked at him with an expression that was part calculation, part resignation, part something else that Volkov could not name. "My name," she said, "is not Elena Sokolova." The train pulled into Moscow Station in Leningrad at 11:03 a.m. Volkov and the woman who was not Elena Sokolova disembarked separately, maintained distance through the station, and met 20 minutes later in a cafe on Nevsky Prospect that she chose because it had multiple exits and a view of the street. What she told him over the next 3 hours would dismantle everything Volkov thought he understood about loyalty, ideology, and the Cold War itself. Her real name was Catherine Meyer. She was born in Boston, Massachusetts in 1951. Her father was a professor of Russian literature at Harvard. Her mother was a translator who had fled Prague after the 1948 communist coup. She had grown up speaking Russian, Czech, and English, immersed in the culture and literature of the Soviet Union, while living in the ideological heart of its enemy. She had been recruited by the CIA in 1973 during her senior year at Radcliffe College. Not because she was ideological, not because she hated communism, but because she had a gift for languages and a face that could pass for Slavic, and a background that made her psychologically suited for deep cover work. The agency had spent 3 years training her, another 2 years building her legend. In 1978, she had been inserted into the Soviet Union through Finland, with documents identifying her as Elena Sokolova, a Soviet citizen returning from a cultural exchange program. For 5 years, she had lived the life of a Soviet translator. She had worked. She had made friends. She had attended party meetings. She had informed on colleagues when required to maintain her cover. She had become, in every way that mattered, the person her documents said she was. And she had fed the CIA intelligence on Soviet cultural policy, on which foreign delegations were being targeted for recruitment, on which Soviet officials were traveling abroad, on the internal politics of the Ministry of Culture. Low-level intelligence. Nothing that would win the Cold War, but the kind of incremental, cumulative intelligence that helped the CIA understand how the Soviet system functioned. Her trips to Leningrad were for meetings with her handler, a CIA officer operating under diplomatic cover at the U.S. consulate. The meetings followed strict protocols. She would check into a hotel, leave through a service entrance, take a series of trams and buses designed to detect surveillance, and arrive at a safe house where her handler would be waiting. They would debrief. She would pass documents. She would receive new instructions. And then she would return to Moscow and resume her life as Elena Sokolova. It was, by CIA standards, a successful operation. She had been in place for 5 years without detection. She had provided valuable intelligence. She had demonstrated the viability of deep cover insertion in the Soviet Union. She was, in the language of the agency, a productive asset. But she was also, she told Volkov, desperately alone. This was the part that the official accounts would omit. The part that did not fit the narrative of espionage as a chess game played by rational actors pursuing strategic objectives. The human cost of living a lie so complete that you forget which parts of yourself are real. She had no one she could talk to, no one who knew her real name, no one who remembered Catherine Meyer. Her parents thought she was dead. The CIA had faked her death in a car accident in 1978 to explain her disappearance. Her friends had mourned her. Her life in America had been erased, and the life she was living in Moscow was a performance that could never stop. She could not form real relationships because every relationship was a potential security risk. She could not express her real opinions because her real opinions were American. She could not be herself because herself was the enemy. She lived in a state of permanent dissociation, watching Elena Sokolova navigate the world while Catherine Meyer observed from somewhere deep inside. The trips to Leningrad were supposed to be operational necessities, but they had become something else. The only time she could speak English, the only time she could be Catherine, the only time she could remember that she was not actually the person everyone thought she was. "I'm not asking you to understand," she said to Volkov. "I'm just telling you what it's like, so you know what you're dealing with." Volkov, who had spent 6 weeks watching her and had constructed an elaborate theory about who she might be, found that the reality was both simpler and more devastating than anything he had imagined. She was not an ideological warrior. She was not a mercenary. She was a woman who had been recruited young, trained thoroughly, and deployed into a situation that was psychologically unsustainable. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because," she said, "you gave me a choice. You could have arrested me. You could have reported me. You could have followed me and caught me with my handler and earned a promotion. But instead, you warned me, so I'm going to give you a choice." "What choice?" "You can arrest me now. You'll be a hero. You'll have caught an American spy. You'll be promoted, decorated, celebrated. Your career will be made. Or you can let me go. Let me make my meeting. Let me continue my work. And in exchange, I'll tell you everything. Not just about my operation, about how the CIA runs agents in the Soviet Union, about their tradecraft, their protocols, their vulnerabilities, about how they recruit, how they communicate, how they exfiltrate. Everything I know, everything they taught me, I'll give it to you. But only if you let me keep working." This was the offer. The moment when Alexei Volkov, senior lieutenant in the GRU, decorated officer, trusted servant of the Soviet state, had to choose between duty and something else. Something that did not have a name in the vocabulary of intelligence work. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Why would you betray the CIA?" "Because Catherine Meyer said, 'I'm tired. I'm tired of being Elena. I'm tired of being alone. I'm tired of pretending. And I think if I help you, maybe you'll help me. Maybe you'll find a way to get me out. Not to America. I can't go back there. But somewhere. Somewhere I can be myself. Somewhere I don't have to lie anymore.'" "That's not possible," Volkov said. "I know," she said. "But maybe you'll try anyway. Because I think you're tired too. I think you're tired of watching people and writing reports and serving a system that doesn't care about you. I think you looked at me and saw someone who was trapped, and you recognized it because you're trapped too. And I think maybe if we help each other, we can both get free." It was a pitch, a recruitment pitch. The kind of pitch that CIA case officers spent years learning to deliver. Appeal to emotion. Offer hope. Create dependency. Establish shared interest. Make the target feel seen, understood, valued. Make them believe that betrayal is actually liberation. Volkov knew this. He had studied these techniques. He had written papers on them. He could identify every element of what she was doing. And yet, sitting across from her in a cafe in Leningrad, while the winter light faded outside, he found that knowledge did not protect him. Because she was right. He was tired. Tired of the surveillance. Tired of the suspicion. Tired of a system that treated everyone as a potential enemy. Tired of watching people live small, careful lives in a country that punished deviation. Tired of being alone in a city of millions. "If I do this," he said, "if I let you go, if I help you, I'm committing treason." "Yes," she said. "I'll be caught eventually. They'll find out. They'll execute me." "Probably," she said. "So why would I do it?" She reached across the table and took his hand. It was the first time they had touched. Her hand was warm, her grip firm. "Because," she said, "for however long we have, we won't be alone." This was how it began. Not with ideology, not with money, not with blackmail or coercion or any of the traditional mechanisms of recruitment. But with two people who had spent too long living lies, who had found in each other a possibility of truth, and who made a choice that would destroy them both. Over the next 8 months, Alexei Volkov and Catherine Meyer constructed what intelligence historians would later call one of the most complex double-agent operations of the Cold War. Volkov continued his surveillance. He filed reports that documented Elena Sokolova's movements, but omitted the crucial details that would have exposed her. He fed the KGB information that was accurate but incomplete, creating the impression of a thorough investigation that was making no progress. Meanwhile, Catherine continued her work for the CIA. She met with her handler. She passed intelligence. She maintained her cover. But she also began to pass information to Volkov. Not the intelligence she was collecting for the CIA, but the methods, the tradecraft, the protocols, how the agency communicated with its agents, how it moved money, how it planned exfiltrations, how it identified and recruited sources. Volkov took this information and began to feed it to the GRU, not directly, not in a way that would reveal his source, but carefully, incrementally, through channels that made it appear he had developed his own sources, his own insights, his own analytical breakthroughs. He became known as an expert on CIA operations. He was promoted. He was given more responsibility. He was trusted. And every 2 weeks, when Catherine took the train to Leningrad, Volkov went with her. They would meet in different cafes, different parks, different safe houses that she had access to through her CIA network. They would talk. They would share information, and they would pretend for a few hours that they were not enemies, not agents, not players in a game that would eventually kill them. They would pretend they were just two people who had found each other in the cold. The operational security was meticulous. They never met in Moscow. They never communicated except in person. They never wrote anything down. They developed a system of signals, a scarf worn a certain way, a book carried in a specific hand, that allowed them to communicate danger or safety without words. They memorized schedules, routes, contingencies. They planned for exposure, for arrest, for the moment when the system would discover what they were doing. But they also fell in love. Not the sanitized, strategic love of intelligence operations, where emotion is a tool and intimacy is a tactic, but the messy, irrational, catastrophic love of two people who should never have met, who had every reason to betray each other, and who chose instead to trust. Catherine told Volkov about growing up in Boston, about her father's library, about learning Russian by reading Tolstoy in the original. Volkov told Catherine about his childhood in Siberia, about joining the military to escape poverty, about discovering that he was good at understanding how people think. They talked about books, about music, about the absurdity of a world divided by ideology into armed camps. They talked about what they would do if they could start over, if they could be anyone, if they could live anywhere. They knew it was fantasy. They knew the Cold War did not allow for defection or escape or happily ever after. They knew that every meeting brought them closer to exposure. They knew that the longer the operation continued, the higher the probability of catastrophic failure. But they continued anyway. Because the alternative, returning to their separate lies, their separate loneliness, their separate prisons, was worse than the risk. The inflection point came in October 1983, 8 months after their first meeting on the Red Arrow. The KGB's second chief directorate had been running a separate investigation into CIA operations in Moscow. They had identified a pattern. American intelligence seemed to have detailed knowledge of GRU counterintelligence procedures. They knew which surveillance teams were active. They knew which safe houses were compromised. They knew which officers were considered vulnerable to recruitment. Someone was leaking. Someone inside the GRU. Someone with access to counterintelligence operations. The investigation focused on a short list of officers who had the necessary access and clearance. Volkov was on that list. Not at the top, not as the primary suspect, but on it. The protocol was standard: enhanced surveillance, communications monitoring, financial audits, interviews with colleagues and family. The investigation would be thorough, methodical, and relentless, and eventually, it would find the gaps in Volkov's reports. The trips to Leningrad that were not officially authorized, the pattern of information that seemed to flow from his analysis to CIA operations. Catherine's handler learned about the investigation through a source in the KGB. The message was passed to Catherine during a meeting in Leningrad. The CIA's assessment was clear. Volkov was compromised. The operation was burned. Catherine needed to be exfiltrated immediately. The exfiltration plan was already in place. It had been developed years earlier as a contingency. Catherine would travel to Leningrad as usual. But instead of returning to Moscow, she would be moved to a safe house near the Finnish border. A CIA team would cross from Finland, extract her, and bring her back to the West. It would be dangerous. It would be complex, but it was possible. The problem was Volkov. The CIA had no plan for him. He was not their asset. He was not their responsibility. He was a Soviet officer who had compromised himself by helping an American agent. From the agency's perspective, he was collateral damage, regrettable but acceptable. Catherine refused. She told her handler that she would not leave without Volkov. The handler explained that extracting a GRU officer was exponentially more difficult than extracting a deep-cover agent. Volkov would be missed immediately. The KGB would lock down the borders. The risk of failure was too high. Catherine said she didn't care. If the CIA wouldn't help Volkov, she wouldn't go. She would stay in Moscow, continue her work, and take her chances with the investigation. The handler reported this to Langley. The response was predictable. Catherine was experiencing emotional compromise. She was not thinking strategically. She needed to be extracted, by force if necessary, before she exposed the entire network. But Catherine had leverage. She knew the identities of other CIA assets in Moscow. She knew the locations of safe houses. She knew communication protocols. If she was arrested and interrogated, she could compromise operations across the Soviet Union. The CIA needed her cooperation, and she was making cooperation conditional on Volkov's extraction. The negotiation took 3 weeks. In the end, Langley agreed, not because they cared about Volkov, but because losing Catherine's cooperation was worse than the risk of trying to extract a GRU officer. The plan was ambitious. Volkov would be arrested as part of the investigation, but before he could be interrogated, he would escape during transport. The escape would be facilitated by a CIA asset inside the prison system. Volkov would make his way to Leningrad, where he would meet Catherine. Together, they would be moved to the Finnish border and extracted. It required perfect timing, multiple assets, and a level of coordination that the CIA had rarely attempted in Soviet territory. The probability of success was estimated at less than 30%, but it was the only option that satisfied Catherine's demand. On November 12, 1983, Alexei Volkov was arrested at his apartment in Moscow. The charges were espionage, treason, and conspiracy against the Soviet state. He was taken to Lefortovo prison, the KGB's main interrogation facility. He was placed in a cell and told that his interrogation would begin the following morning. That night, at 2:17 a.m., a guard opened his cell and told him to come with him. Volkov, who had been briefed on the plan, followed. They walked through corridors that should have been monitored but weren't. They passed checkpoints that should have been staffed but were empty. They reached a service entrance where a vehicle was waiting. Volkov got in. The vehicle drove through Moscow's empty streets to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside the warehouse, Catherine was waiting. They had 48 hours to reach the Finnish border before the escape was discovered, and the manhunt began. They traveled in the back of a truck carrying industrial equipment, hidden in a compartment that had been constructed specifically for this operation. They moved at night, stopped during the day, followed routes that avoided major checkpoints. On November 14th at 4:33 a.m., they crossed into Finland. A CIA team was waiting. They were taken to a safe house, debriefed, and flown to West Germany. From there, they were moved to the United States. The consequences were immediate and severe. The KGB launched a massive investigation into how a GRU officer had escaped from Lefortovo. The guard who had facilitated the escape was arrested and executed. The CIA asset who had coordinated the operation was exposed and killed. The safe houses used in the exfiltration were raided. Several other CIA operations in the Soviet Union were compromised. The GRU's counterintelligence division was purged. Officers who had worked with Volkov were interrogated. His entire analytical output was reviewed for signs of deception. The damage assessment concluded that Volkov had compromised dozens of operations, exposed multiple sources, and provided the CIA with detailed knowledge of GRU procedures. Catherine's cover as Elena Sokolova was blown. The KGB identified her as an American agent. Her colleagues at the Ministry of Culture were interrogated. Several were arrested on suspicion of collaboration. The entire ministry was subjected to enhanced security screening. In Washington, the operation was classified at the highest level. Volkov and Catherine were debriefed extensively. The intelligence they provided was used to restructure CIA operations in the Soviet Union. Volkov's knowledge of GRU counterintelligence procedures was considered invaluable. Catherine's 5 years of deep cover experience became a case study in long-term agent management. But the CIA also recognized that the operation had been compromised by emotion. The official assessment concluded that Catherine's relationship with Volkov had created unacceptable risk. Future deep cover agents would be subjected to enhanced psychological screening to identify vulnerability to emotional attachment. The doctrine was clear. Agents who fell in love were agents who could not be trusted. Volkov and Catherine were given new identities and resettled in the United States. They were not allowed to contact their families. They were not allowed to discuss their past. They were not allowed to work in fields related to intelligence. They were, in effect, prisoners of their own rescue. They married in 1984, in a small ceremony attended only by their CIA handlers. They lived in a suburb of Virginia, in a house that was monitored by the agency, under names that were not their own. Volkov worked as a consultant, analyzing Soviet military doctrine for defense contractors. Catherine taught Russian literature at a community college. They had 2 children. They lived quiet lives. They grew old together. But they never stopped being watched. The CIA maintained surveillance not because they were suspected of continued espionage, but because they knew too much. They were living repositories of classified information, human archives that could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. In 2001, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, some of the files related to their case were declassified. The Russian government released documents showing that the KGB had suspected Volkov of treason, but had never been able to prove it before his escape. The CIA released limited information confirming that an operation had taken place, but omitting most details. Volkov died in 2008 at the age of 54 from a heart attack. Catherine died in 2019 at the age of 68 from cancer. Their children, who had grown up knowing their parents had worked for the government, but not the specifics, learned the truth only after Catherine's death, when the CIA allowed them access to a sanitized version of the operational file. The file revealed the scope of what their parents had done, the risks they had taken, the people who had died to get them out, the intelligence they had provided, the operations they had compromised, the damage and the value measured in lives and secrets and the currency of the Cold War. But it did not reveal what the operation meant, what it showed about loyalty and love and the human capacity for choice in systems designed to eliminate choice, what it demonstrated about the cost of living, lies, and the price of truth, what it suggested about the possibility of connection in a world built on division. Those questions remain, not in the files, not in the official histories, but in the space between what happened and what it meant, in the gap between the operational record and the human experience. What is known, Alexei Volkov, a Soviet intelligence officer, helped an American spy escape detection and eventually defected with her to the United States. What is unknown, whether he did it for love or for ideology, or for some combination of both that cannot be separated or quantified. What is documented? The operation compromised multiple intelligence networks, resulted in several deaths, and provided valuable intelligence to both sides. What is not documented? What it felt like to choose another person over your country, to risk everything for someone you met on a train, to build a life in the shadow of what you destroyed. The Cold War produced thousands of such cases. Officers who defected, agents who were turned, operations that succeeded or failed based on human decisions that could not be predicted or controlled. The archives are full of them. The histories catalog them. The analysts study them. But this case remains singular. Not because of its operational significance, which was real but not unprecedented, but because of what it revealed about the limits of ideology as a motivator and the power of human connection as a force that intelligence services could not fully account for or defend against. The Soviet system was built on the assumption that loyalty to the state would override personal attachment. The CIA was built on the assumption that agents could be managed, controlled, directed towards strategic objectives. Both systems failed to account for the possibility that two people trapped in separate lies might find in each other something worth more than the secrets they were keeping. This is not a romantic conclusion. Volkov and Catherine paid for their choice with decades of surveillance, isolation, and the knowledge that people died because of what they did. They lived with that. They carried it. They never claimed that love justified the cost. But they also never regretted it. In their debriefings, in their later interviews with CIA historians, in the conversations they had with each other in the house in Virginia, they maintained that they would make the same choice again. Not because it was right, not because it was justified, but because the alternative, continuing to live as Alexei Volkov and Elena Sokolova, separate, alone, serving systems that did not care about them, was not living at all. The question that remains, the question that the files cannot answer, is whether this makes them heroes or traitors, whether they were brave or selfish, whether they were victims of the Cold War or agents of their own destiny. The answer, perhaps, is that they were all of these things, that human beings are too complex to fit into the categories that intelligence services use, that the Cold War, for all its ideological clarity, was ultimately fought by people who did not fit the narratives their governments constructed, and that sometimes, in the machinery of espionage and counterintelligence and global conflict, two people find each other and make a choice that does not make sense strategically, that cannot be justified operationally, that violates every protocol and principle they were trained to follow. And they do it anyway. Because in the end, the Cold War was not just about ideology or territory or nuclear weapons. It was about what people were willing to sacrifice for systems that claimed to represent them, and what they were willing to risk for the possibility of something else. Alexei Volkov and Catherine Meyer risked everything. They lost much. They gained something that cannot be measured in intelligence assessments or damage reports. They gained each other. And for 40 years in a house in Virginia, under names that were not their own, they lived with the consequences of that choice. The files are closed now. The operation is history. The Cold War is over. But the question remains, what would you choose? Your country or another person? Your duty or your heart? The lie you were trained to live or the truth you found in someone else? There is no right answer. There is only the choice, and the cost, and the life you build afterward. That is what this case shows. Not how espionage works, but how people work, how they break, how they choose, how they survive, and sometimes how they love.